And yet God's perfect plan would include an element of great suffering. God's perfect plan. Do you hear that? God's perfect plan. For the one who was greeted as, "Hail, favored one, you have found favor in the sight of the Lord." And yet now she hears about a sword piercing her soul. What are you talking about, Willis? What are you talking about? Can you imagine that God's perfect plan for His chosen mother of His Son would include that kind of torment? That just doesn't fit with our concept of God. We want a God who makes everything easy and enjoyable and right and good by our definition of good. And yet here Mary hears about a sword to pierce her own soul. And unknowns to her, inconceivable suffering of His very own Son. And that was God's perfect plan for Mary and for Jesus. Now the years were going to pass. We don't have much of information on the 30 years of His life until His ministry kicks in, and then we get details. Next week we'll look at an encounter when He was 12 years old and He goes missing, of all things. And we get a little hint of His awareness, even as a 12-year-old, as to the mission that He was on. The years were going to pass. 30 or so. And I can't help but wonder if somewhere along the way, Mary thought about this encounter with Simeon and this sword piercing her soul. I say, well, so far so good. This kid is a delight to raise. He's not introducing any suffering into my world. Can you imagine a kid under your care that didn't have a sinful nature? Can you imagine growing up as his siblings? You know, dude never did anything wrong. I mean, if Mama asked him who did it, he always told her. You know, there was no place to hide. But as the years passed, and the conjecture historically is that somewhere along the way, Joseph died, Jesus just kind of slid into the caregiving role of his mother Mary. And man, what a great son he was. And I wonder if somewhere along the way, as the years passed, she didn't say, well, maybe that old dude in the temple didn't know exactly what he was talking about. Maybe there's not going to be a sword piercing my soul after all. But then it began. And as he began to proclaim truth, as truth had never been proclaimed to them in their lives, and there was no place to hide, the opposition began to rise up. No matter how he authenticated his message with miracle after miracle after miracle, the opposition came and increased until finally the decision was made that he had to go. And they put together the circumstances in such a way so that Jesus was to die. And they used the Romans as a pawn to ensure that it happened, which was all fulfillment of prophecy. But when the time came and Jesus, having already suffered greatly, was nailed to a cross outside of Jerusalem, and of his followers, it was only a few ladies, maybe young John and Mary, who were at the foot of his cross. And suddenly old Simeon turned out to know what it was that he was talking about, as it would have been figuratively a sword piercing her soul. Can you imagine a greater pain? I can't imagine, Leanne, the pain that your friends are feeling. As a husband, a son, father, a nephew, a friend is lost. But to see it done like it was done to Jesus, I can't imagine a greater pain than that. But need I remind you that 30 years before, God had told her, it's coming. God's perfect plan, not only for his son, but the one who bore him into this world, would suffer greatly. Here's what I think we must do with that reality. We must not then be surprised when God's perfect plan includes suffering for you and I today. Why should it surprise us that in this broken world we too suffer as a result of the sinfulness of humanity? Why should it surprise us when given enough time we watch a nation that once revered the law of God treat it so lightly and reject it? And that as a result, we who fear him and look on wonder just what kind of suffering that will introduce into our lives. Why should that surprise us if God's perfect plan incorporates that and capitalizes on it to accomplish exactly what he wants to accomplish? I would contend with you today that there are no accidents in this world. There are countless what I would now call unexpecteds. It doesn't flow as easily off the tongue, I get it. You really don't expect a big old hunk of hay mound to fall on you. You just don't expect that. But was God taken by surprise? Was God caught off guard? Is there anything in that God can't use to accomplish his purposes? And I say to you, absolutely not. God can use it all. And that had my mother 60 years ago been told that there's going to come a day. Now, it wouldn't be a sword necessarily, like Mary got, but maybe a good sharp jab in the ribs when she got word that there'd been an unexpected happen. Can we not begin? Now, Mary wouldn't have understood on Friday evening as she lay there in the dirt at the foot of her son's cross. She would not have understood what it was that God was up to at that point. But it wouldn't be long. Come Sunday morning when Jesus defeated sin and death once for all, and the theologians began to communicate what it was that God was accomplishing in the midst of that great suffering and travail. God was giving birth to new life for us all, once for all. Has God somehow then lost his knack of giving birth to new life for you and I in the midst of our suffering in the here and now day? Has he lost his ability to bring glory out of the brokenness that we come in contact with? I'm sorry, no. And you see that gift of brokenness that God entrusted to me back on